In the previous lesson, we asked what was the sapiens' secret of success, and we explained that it was the sapiens' ability to cooperate flexibly with large numbers of strangers. This ability, in turn, was based on the sapiens' ability to talk about things that don't really exist and to create common stories, common imagined realities. This gave sapiens the potential not only to adapt to different natural environments, but also to start creating more and more artificial, man-made environments. We used our imagination, and our ancestors used their imagination not only to adapt themselves to the world as it is, but also in order to create new worlds. In this lesson, the third lesson, we will look at the world of our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago and try to understand what was it like. More importantly, we will try to understand not only what was happening in the outside world surrounding sapiens, but also in the world inside people's heads, at their view of the world, to try and understand to the best of our ability how they understood themselves and the world around them. This is very important in order to understand human nature, human history, and human psychology even today. If you really want to understand us sapiens, how we behave and think, you have to get inside the heads of Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Because our species was shaped during the long millennia, the thousands, the tens of thousands of years in which we lived as hunter-gatherers and not as peasants and farmers or industry workers or office workers. All these types of lifestyles, living as a peasant or as a herder of animals or as an office clerk or as a factory worker, all these lifestyles, they appeared relatively late in the history of Homo sapiens. Only in the last 10,000 years were there any peasants, and only in the last 200 or 300 years did people start to live in large industrial cities as we lived today. So for the vast majority of the existence of people like us, with the same basic mental and cognitive abilities, they lived like hunter-gatherers, and their way of life shaped, to a large extent, the bodies and the minds which we still carry with us today. Many of the problems of the world today, in the 21st century, in an industrial and even post-industrial environment, are the result of this very problematic interaction between the minds and bodies of hunter-gatherers and the environment of big cities with cars and trains and airplanes and nuclear weapons and computers and so forth. Subconsciously, we still live in the Stone Age, even if the world around us is the industrial world of the 21st century. This is the basic premise, the basic argument of the field of study known as evolutionary psychology, which will be important for us in this lesson and also in some of the next lesson. Evolutionary psychology, its main insight is that not only the body is shaped by evolutionary pressures, but also the mind and the psychology are shaped by evolutionary pressures, and that therefore, in order to understand our psychology today, we need to understand the pressures, the conditions that shaped this psychology. This sounds very theoretical, maybe complicated, so I will give a simple example, or a few examples, of what we are talking about. One example, quite simple one, concerns our eating habits. Evolutionary psychologists argue that the way we eat today, not only what we eat, but actually the way that we eat, is shaped to a large extent by the conditions of our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago. Why, for example, does the world today, at least the affluent world, suffers from a plague of obesity, of people eating far too much for what is good for them and becoming too fat? Why is that? Well, explain evolutionary psychology, it all results from the conditions under which our ancestors lived 30 or 40 or 50,000 years ago, and the complicated interaction between those conditions and the situation today. 50,000 years ago, if a woman was walking along the savannah and suddenly seeing a tree full of ripened fruit, the most sensible thing to do back then was to eat as many of these fruits as quickly as possible, for two reasons. First of all, sweet things with a lot of sugar in them, were very rare in the savannah 50,000 years ago. It was a great thing to find such a thing, to find such a source of ready available sugar. And except for fruits, there were hardly any sweets in the savannah. So it was a good idea to eat many of these fruits. And secondly, it was a good idea to eat as many of these fruits as quickly as possible, because if the woman ate just one fruit or two fruits and went away and said to herself, okay, I'll come again tomorrow and eat more of them, when she came back tomorrow, in all likelihood, she would have found that the local baboon band came over the tree during the intervening hours and finished everything, and there is nothing for her left to eat. So the right thing to do 50,000 years ago, if you came across a big pile of sweet things, was to eat as many of them as quickly as possible. People who did that, they had a better chance of surviving and passing their genes on to the next generation, including the genes for eating a lot of sweet things quickly. People who refrained from eating too much sweet things, they had a worse chance of surviving, and their genes did not come to us. Now, let's switch from 50,000 years ago to today. Today I go and open the refrigerator door, and I found inside a chocolate cake. Now, how to react to this chocolate cake? My DNA and my basic urges and psychology, they don't know that I'm living in an affluent society in the 21st century with a refrigerator. As far as they are concerned, they are still in the savannah 50,000 years ago, and this is the only sweet things they know. So my DNA and my basic psychological urges tell me to react to the chocolate cake in my refrigerator the same way that my great-great-great-great-grandmother, from whom I inherited these genes, reacted to the fruit tree in Africa 50,000 years ago. So I take the chocolate cake and I eat as much of it as quickly as possible, for fear that if I just eat a little and close the door, when I come back tomorrow, maybe the local baboon band will eat everything and I have nothing left for me. So we keep reacting to food according to the same basic logic that was good 40 or 50,000 years ago, but which is incompatible with conditions today. Again, the basic premise of this field of evolutionary psychology is that subconsciously, in the deepest layers of our mentality, of our psyche, they still live in the savannah. They hadn't had time to update themselves and to realize that they are now living in an affluent industrial society in the 21st century. So this is one example of what evolutionary psychologists have in mind. Another example concerns a much more controversial issue than our eating habits. It concerns our sexual and romantic and family relations. What kind of family relations and sexual habits did our ancestors have 40 and 50 and 60,000 years ago? Some scholars believe that the ancient foragers, our ancestors, did not live Like people think that everybody live in monogamous relationships and nuclear families. So some scholars say no. Back in those days, 40, 50,000 years ago, people lived in communes and not in monogamous nuclear families. What does it mean that they lived in communes? Well, at any given time, a woman could have had relations, sexual and romantic relations, with several men and even women. And similarly, a man could have had, either at the same time or one after the other, relations with several women and also maybe with several men. And there was no concept of marriage for life and a nuclear family. Now, this does not mean that they were engaged in all the time in promiscuous sex and one-night stands, because you have to remember that these people lived in very small and intimate communities in which everybody knew everybody else. So it was not like jumping from a bed of one stranger to the bed of another stranger, but jumping from the bed of somebody you know very well to the bed of somebody else that you know very, very well. And in fact, back then, people knew the other members of their band much better in some ways than people today know their spouses. For example, if you lived in a band of people 50,000 years ago, you had a chance to see how the other behave in very extreme conditions, which today few husbands and wives get the chance to see how their spouse reacts, say, during a mammoth hunt, or when a lion starts chasing you. So few husbands know what the wife would actually do if a lion starts chasing him. But 50,000 years ago, people knew that. They encountered such conditions, not every day, but from time to time. So in many ways, people knew each other much more deeply than even married couples today. And therefore, don't imagine that the ancient communes were like this alienated, promiscuous sex that sometimes happens in the modern world. It was something very different. Now, another thing that a certain group, not all scholars agree on it, just a certain group of scholars who believe that people used to live together in communes, they also argue that parenthood was very different from parenthood today. Today, at least according to these traditional family values, every child has or should have one father and one mother that raise him or her with their combined effort. But, argues an influential group of scholars, back before the agricultural revolution, 20,000 or 50,000 years ago, children were not raised by couples. Children were raised by the entire tribe. Of course, their mother was very important. She suckled them and she took the best care of them. But all the other adults, or at least some of the other adults in the commune, they also helped taking care. And the entire commune basically raised together all the children. Now, what they also argue, these scholars, is that the concept of fatherhood, which is very central for the modern family or the traditional family, was actually non-existent in the original communes, because people could never be sure, men could never be sure whether a child is theirs or of somebody else, because there was no nuclear families and monogamous marriages. And this is not just idle speculations, because anthropologists have actually found some societies, some tribes today who believe in a different concept of fatherhood, in what is known as collective fatherhood. This means, according to the belief of such people, that a child could have more than one father. They argue that the belief of those tribes is that when a child is growing in the womb of a woman, it is nourished by the sperm, by the semen of men, but not just of one man, but it can be nourished by the sperm of many men. Just as an apple tree can be nourished by the water coming from different clouds, not just one cloud, so a child growing in the womb of a mother can be nourished by the sperm of more than one man. And it may sound very silly to you, but take into account that until the 19th or 20th century, with modern medicine and modern embryology and genetics, people did not have any firm evidence that a child must always be born just from one sperm cell and one egg cell of one man and one woman. So there was no clear evidence that this notion of collective fatherhood is impossible. And women who lived back then in such societies that believed in collective fatherhood, when a woman was pregnant, she took care, if she was a good mother, to have sex during her pregnancy, not just with one man, but to have sex with many men, so that the child that is growing in her womb would receive good qualities from all kinds of men, not just from the best hunter, but also from the man who is best in communicating with the spirits, and from the man who is best in producing knives and spear points, and from the man who is the best lover. Why not have my child have the qualities of all these men? Why just one man? So according to one school of thought, it's important to realize it's not all scientists who believe this theory, it's just one school of thought. People tens of thousands of years ago, they were used to living in communes, not in nuclear families. And they were used to raising children together, the entire commune together, and not just by a pair of parents, a mother and a father. And according to this idea, just as people are naturally inclined to eat a lot of sweet things quickly, so also people are naturally inclined to live in communes and to practice collective parenthood or collective fatherhood. And if this is true, say this school of evolutionary psychologists, then many of the problems which we experience today in our romantic and sexual and family lives are the result of a mismatch between our biological program and the actual conditions of our life today. We are programmed, have been programmed tens of thousands of years ago to live in these communes, and yet now everybody expects us to live in a nuclear family, just two parents raising the children together. And argue these scholars, all the problems of high rates of divorce, of infidelity between couples, of all kinds of psychological difficulties and traumas of children, they are all the result of the fact that we are forcing ourselves to live in ways which are simply incompatible with our biological program. Now, as I said, this is not the truth. It is just a theory about humankind and about history and about the way that people tens of thousands of years ago lived. Many scholars vehemently reject everything I said in the last few minutes. They vehemently reject this entire idea, fantasy of an original commune and collective fatherhood and things like that. They insist that the nuclear family and monogamy were an integral part of sapiens society tens of thousands of years ago. Yes, they argue the bands of hunter-gatherers 40,000 years ago, they were more communal than the way that we live today. But even those bands, despite all the cooperation and all the shared food and shared effort, even they were composed of these basic cells of a nuclear family composed of two parents raising their children together, perhaps with some help from the neighbors, but with the parents playing the main role. So this is a huge argument much bigger than the argument about food habits, this argument about our sexuality, our family relations, our parental system. In order to resolve the argument, the controversy between those who believe in the primordial commune and those who believe that even tens of thousands of years ago, humans and sapiens lived in nuclear families and raised children, just two parents raising their children. In order to resolve this controversy, we need to know something. We need to have some hard evidence about how our ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, actually lived. Unfortunately, there is few certainties regarding the living conditions of our forager ancestors. There is little evidence, and much of this very interesting debate between the ancient commune school and the eternal monogamy school is based on very flimsy evidence. There is no written records from 40,000 years ago telling us how people lived and how families and communities looked like and whether they knew about fathers or they didn't know about fathers. The archaeological record there is some archaeological record, but the archaeological record consists mainly of some fossilized bones and stone tools, and this is hardly enough to reconstruct the rich life of people 20,000 or 40,000 years ago. Apart from the stone tools, we also have at our disposal some genetic evidence. We can learn all kinds of things about our ancestors and the ways that they lived by examining the genes in our bodies today, because these genes came to us from our ancestors. The last main source of information we have in order to understand the lives of the ancient hunter-gatherers is direct observation of modern hunter-gatherers who survived in places such as Australia or the Kalahari Desert until recent times, and in some places until even this day. This is a very important source of information because we can observe the hunter-gatherer way of life directly, but it is also quite problematic because it's dangerous to assume that people who lived 40,000 years ago in, say, China or India lived in the same way as hunter-gatherers today live in the Kalahari Desert or in the Australian desert. What makes it even more problematic to reconstruct the world of people who lived 20,000 or 40,000 years ago is that it was not a single world or a unified world, but rather many different worlds. The most notable characteristic of hunter-gatherer societies is how different they are one from the other. People often imagine as if all hunter-gatherer societies have exactly the same basic social structure, the same beliefs, the same religions, the same values and norms. But this is a complete mistake. There is and was an amazing variety of social patterns, beliefs, values and norms among different groups of hunter-gatherers. Prior to the agricultural revolution, it is estimated that the world, the entire world, was populated by about 5 million to 7 or 8 million foragers, hunter-gatherers, and they were probably divided into thousands of separate tribes and bands, each with its own language and culture and religion and behavior patterns. It's obvious that two groups who lived in completely different ecological zones probably had different behavior. But even two groups living in the same area under similar, even identical ecological conditions might have had very different societies and cultures and beliefs. This, after all, was one of the main legacies of the cognitive revolution about which we spoke in the previous lesson. Thanks to the appearance of fictive language, the ability to create imagined realities, even people with the same genetic makeup, who lived under similar ecological conditions, were still able to create very different imagined realities, which manifested themselves in different norms and values and behavior. For example, there is every reason to believe that a forager band that lived, say, 30,000 years ago on the spot where Oxford University now stands would have spoken a different language than a group living where Cambridge University is now situated. One band might have been very belligerent and had a lot of violence. The other band might have been much more peaceful in its outlook and its behavior. Perhaps the band at Cambridge lived in a commune, whereas the band at Oxford was based on nuclear families. Perhaps the people at Cambridge might have spent long hours carving wooden statues of their guardian spirits, whereas in Oxford, people were used to worshipping through dancing and singing. It's possible. The people at Cambridge might have believed in reincarnation and souls, whereas the people at Oxford thought that this was nonsense. In Cambridge, same-sex sexual relationships between men or between women might have been normative and acceptable, whereas in Oxford they might have been taboo. So there are many differences of this kind which might have existed between different human bands prior to the agricultural revolution, even in the same area. This implies that the heated debates about what was the natural way of life of Homo sapiens miss the main point. The really important point is that ever since the cognitive revolution, there hasn't been a single natural way of life for sapiens. There have been only many cultural choices from among a very wide spectrum of possibilities. There are, however, some generalizations which we can probably make about all forager societies, despite all the differences that probably did have some common characteristics. And the next segment of this lesson will be dedicated to discussing some of these common characteristics that probably were shared by all human societies in the world prior to the agricultural revolution.